The number on the invoice was $412. Nadia Ose stood at the service counter of Hargrove Automotive and read it twice. She was still in her coveralls, the dark navy ones she wore to her Saturday errands because she had learned a long time ago to stop apologizing for what her work looked like. The cotton was faded at the knees. There was a faint trace of gear oil on her left forearm that no amount of scrubbing had fully lifted. The man behind the counter, whose name badge said Derek in block capital letters, had not looked her in the eye once since she walked in through the glass door, and the small electronic chime above it sounded. $412 for a brake inspection and a single rotor replacement on a 6-year-old sedan with 63,000 miles on it. She set her keys on the counter without making a sound. "Can you walk me through the labor breakdown?" she said. Derek had one of those voices that managed to be both flat and slightly impatient, the voice of someone who has made a decision before the other person finishes the sentence. He said the brake job was standard and the rotor was warped and the labor was 2 hours at $85 an hour and the part came in at $162 and the rest was the inspection fee. He said it like he was reciting a grocery list, his eyes moving just past her shoulder to the work order clipboard on the wall. Nadia looked at him. She did not blink. "That rotor lists at $68 wholesale," she said. "And a front rotor swap on that model is 45 minutes of labor, not 2 hours. Derek's expression did not change exactly. It shifted. A small recalibration behind the eyes, the kind that happens when an assumption wobbles but hasn't quite fallen. When the territory is suddenly not matching the map, but the map is what you trust. "Ma'am, this is our standard rate. If you'd like to speak with our service manager, I can get him." "I'll wait," she said. "Here is where you need to stay close, because what happened in that lobby is not the whole story. It is the surface of the story." Before we get to what Nadia finally placed on that counter, before we get to what the service manager's face did in the moment after he read it, let me take you back to where this knowledge came from, and why she was standing there in those faded coveralls, with every number memorized before she ever pulled into the parking lot. 37 years earlier, in a neighborhood on the east side of Cleveland where the houses were modest and close together and the winters arrived without apology, Nadia Ose grew up watching her father work. Theodore Ose ran a one-bay garage out of the cinder-block structure behind their house on Spruce Avenue, and the smell of that garage, motor oil and cold concrete, and the faint metallic sharpness of brake cleaner was the smell of home to her in the way that some people's homes smelled like bread or like wood smoke. He worked on the neighbors' cars for fair prices, and he worked on Saturdays and sometimes on Sundays in the deeper part of winter when someone needed something done and didn't have the money to wait for Monday in a different shop. He kept a yellow legal pad hanging on a nail beside the hydraulic lift, and every job was logged on it in his careful printing. The part number, the labor time, the exact cost. No rounding, no approximations. He used to say that a number was either honest or it wasn't. There was no middle. Nadia's mother worked the early shift at the hospital laundry 3 days a week, and on the days she was home in the mornings she would bring Theodore his coffee out to the garage in the white ceramic mug he preferred, and she and Nadia would stand in the doorway for a few minutes, watching him work, before the day required them elsewhere. Nadia remembers the way his hands moved under a car, deliberate and without hesitation, the way a surgeon's hands move, as if every action had been rehearsed so many times that doubt had simply run out of room. He had large hands, scarred at the knuckles from 20 years of work, and he was meticulous about them in a way that his daughter understood only later as a matter of professional pride. He cleaned them completely at the end of every job, not just the oil from the current task, but everything. And he checked them under the work light before he wrote the invoice because he did not want the paper to look like it had been written in haste. The garage was cold in winter. Cold in the bone-settling way that a building insulated with nothing but ambition gets cold, where the space heater in the corner ran its best effort, and the result was a narrow, warm zone around the workbench and concrete floor, everywhere else that held the cold, the way a battery holds a charge. Nadia learned to keep moving. She learned that from him. He never stood still when there was work to do. Not to stay warm, not to think, not for any reason. And she had absorbed that from proximity in the way children absorb everything their parents do before they know they're absorbing it. She was 8 years old the first time she helped him bleed a brake line, crouching beside the rear wheel well with a piece of clear plastic tubing while he pumped the pedal from the driver's seat and called out to her to tell him when the bubbles stopped coming through. She was 11 when she replaced her first complete set of pads on her own. her father standing with his arms crossed 2 steps away, not interfering, watching in the particular way he watched her work. The concentrated attention of someone assessing whether you have understood the thing they showed you, not just the procedure, but the reason behind it. When she tightened the last bolt and stood up, he looked at the work from both sides and said, "Torque spec on those bolts is 94 foot-pounds. Let me watch you set it." She set the torque wrench, and it clicked at exactly the right point. He nodded once and went back inside for his coffee. By the time she was 14, she could do a complete front-end alignment by feel and confirm it with the measurements. Her father didn't teach her because he needed the help, though he did need it. The work was real and the income was not large, and the difference one capable person made in a one-bay garage was not nothing. He taught her because he believed that knowledge was the only thing nobody could repossess. Not the landlord, not the bank, not the boss who looked past you in the doorway. Knowledge rode with you. It didn't appear on a balance sheet. Nobody could file a claim against it. After school, she went to the branch library on West 25th Street and checked out the factory service manuals when they had them and the Chiltern guides when they didn't. She read flat-rate labour time guides the way other kids read novels, running her finger down the columns, memorising the standard times for common jobs. There was a geometry to it that she found satisfying, the same way she found geometry class satisfying. Everything had a precise value, and the precise value was derivable, and once you knew how to derive it, you could always verify what someone was telling you against the truth. Her father had a phrase on a small index card taped to the workbench at eye level, positioned so he saw it every time he straightened up from work. The card was old, yellowed and curling slightly at the corners, with a faint oil thumbprint on the left edge from years of being touched. The phrase was in his own printing, in the same hand as the yellow legal pad. "The work tells the truth. The invoice better match." He died in October of Nadia's sophomore year at Cleveland State. Heart attack on a Tuesday afternoon while he was finishing a transmission service on a neighbour's Buick LeSabre. The neighbour's daughter found him when she came to retrieve the car. He was on the concrete floor near the front driver's side tyre. The car was done. The invoice was written out completely on the yellow legal pad. The customer's copy folded neatly and tucked under the wiper blade. He had not rounded anything. Nadia came home from school and stayed 2 weeks. She sat in the garage the first night and did not turn on the lights, just sat on the metal stool beside the workbench in the dark and the cold until her mother came out and put a blanket around her shoulders and sat with her, not talking. She went back to school because he would have been quietly and firmly furious with any other decision. She knew this about him clearly enough that it made the decision for her even when nothing else in the world was clear. She finished her degree in May, 4 years later, standing in the graduation line in a rented gown, and when the diploma was handed to her, she thought about the yellow legal pad, which she had taken from its nail beside the lift and folded once and placed in the inside pocket of her bag the evening after the service, where it had stayed since. She spent 4 years in Detroit working for a Tier 1 brake components supplier, learning in those years the full industrial scale of what her father had taught her at the small end. How tolerances were set, how specifications were written and tested and revised, how a thermal performance gap of 3% under repeated high heat cycling could propagate into a real-world failure that a manufacturer would spend $40 million tracing back to a design decision made in a conference room by people who had never held the part in their hands. She learned that the distance between the theory and the practice was always measured in physical reality, and that the only way to close that distance reliably was to have done the physical thing yourself, at least once, in conditions that were not controlled. The Detroit years were educational in ways that went beyond the engineering. She was one of 3 women in her division of 19 engineers, and the only black woman in the building at her level during all 4 years she worked there. She learned to navigate the space between what she knew and what people assumed she knew, which was a gap that required constant management. She learned that the most effective way to close that gap was not to announce what she knew, not to lead meetings with credentials or preface statements with her degrees, but to simply do the work at the level the work required and let the work be the evidence. She learned that patience was not passivity, that waiting for the work to speak was not the same as being silent. She filed her first internal technical memo in her second year, a 6-page analysis of a recurring thermal failure mode in a specific rotor geometry that the division had been investigating without resolution for 11 months. The analysis identified the cause in 3 pages and proposed a design modification in 2 more and included a cost estimate in the 6th. The division head read it twice and scheduled a meeting for the following week and told her at the start of that meeting, in front of the other engineers, that it was the clearest technical document he had seen come through his department in 4 years. She kept her face composed. She said, "Thank you." She went back to her desk and kept working. She moved to Columbus in her late 20s to a mid-size powertrain manufacturer that made braking systems for medium-duty commercial vehicles. The work there was different from Detroit in its scale, closer to the real-world use conditions, closer to the kind of problems that her father had solved with his hands in the cold garage on Spruce Avenue, though filtered now through data systems and materials, science and computational modeling that would have been unrecognizable to him. She brought both sides of the knowledge with her, the physical and the theoretical, and in that particular combination she was something the Columbus facility had not had before and was not certain what to do with. She rose from senior engineer to principal engineer in 4 years, moving through the organization without noise, without politics, without anything except the quality and the completeness of the work she produced. In her 4th year, she filed her first US patent. The claim was narrow and technical, concerning the geometry of thermal dissipation grooves in cast iron disc rotors under conditions of repeated high-heat cycling, the specific failure mode she had first identified in Detroit, and spent 3 years developing a structural solution to. The patent was not the kind that made the news. It was the kind that quietly changed how 7 brake assemblies were designed over the following decade, in vehicles driven by people who never knew her name and had no reason to. The second patent came 18 months later, the third 2 years after that, and through all of it, through Detroit and Columbus, and the long hours in test facilities that smelled like hot metal and brake dust, and the particular institutional smell of fluorescent-lit conference rooms where important decisions were made by people who disagreed about which data to trust, she kept the yellow legal pad in the inside pocket of her work bag. Not the original, which was too fragile to carry after 9 years and lived now in a keepsake box on the shelf of her bedroom closet. A copy she had made herself on a fresh sheet, rewriting her father's column headers in her own handwriting. Part number, labour time, cost. It went everywhere with her, into every meeting, every shop, every facility review, every patent deposition. Not as a talisman, as a reminder of the principle that organised everything else. The work tells the truth, and the invoice better match, and the distance between those two things is always measurable, always documentable, always the thing that matters. Meridian Drive Technologies found her through the 3rd patent. A member of their technical advisory board had reviewed the patent during a landscape analysis for an electric vehicle braking program the company was trying to rescue, a $40 million development effort that had been running 18 months behind schedule because the team had been adding complexity that the specification didn't actually require, and nobody with the right combination of theoretical grounding and practical knowledge had been in the room long enough to say so. The board member passed the patent to the CEO with 2 lines of annotation. This person knows both sides of the problem. Find out if she's available. She was not immediately available. She had a program to finish in Columbus. But the recruiting conversation continued for 11 months, by phone and by meeting and by the gradual accumulation of information on both sides, and in February she accepted the position of Chief Engineer of Powertrain and Braking Systems at Meridian Drive Technologies. She was 44 years old. 9 months later, on a Saturday morning in November, she drove her 6-year-old sedan to Hargrove Automotive for a brake inspection. She had felt a slight pulse in the pedal under hard deceleration the previous week, a specific tactile signal, and she wanted confirmation of what she already suspected and a service record to go with the parts. She walked into the shop in her coveralls, her work bag over one shoulder, and she expected a fair price. $412. The service manager came out from the back when Derek paged him. His name was Cole. He moved with the measured pace of a man who didn't like to be pulled from his work, and he had the look of someone who had been in the business long enough to have developed a series of postures for different kinds of situations at the counter, and the posture he arranged himself into when he saw Nadia was not quite dismissive, but it was not the posture he would have arranged himself into for someone who arrived differently. "Is there a problem with the service?" he said. "The labour time is inflated by approximately 40%, Nadia said. And the rotor markup is 62% over wholesale. That falls outside industry standard even for a full service shop." Cole looked at the invoice, then at her, then back at the invoice. "Ma'am, I've been in this business for 23 years. That job took 2 hours." "I know the job," she said. I have known it for a long time. The factory service manual for that vehicle generation places the front rotor replacement at 40 to 50 minutes. The flat rate guide confirms that range. 2 hours is not supported by either. There was a pause in the lobby. A man in one of the orange plastic chairs had looked up from his phone, not because her voice was loud, it wasn't loud, but because it had a quality of precision that the room was not used to hearing in this particular configuration. A woman in work clothes at the counter with her hands resting flat on it, and no effect in her voice except accuracy. A younger woman near the self-serve coffee station had stopped moving her paper cup. Cole's posture shifted in a way that was not quite visible but was felt. The hardness underneath his controlled surface moved slightly closer to the surface. "We document our labor times," he said. "I'm sure you do," Nadia said. "I'm asking you to reconcile the documented time against the flat rate standard and apply the correct parts markup. That's all I'm asking." He looked at her for a moment in which he was deciding something. "What do you do for work?" he said. He asked it with the particular inflection of someone who believes they already know the range of possible answers, and that none of the possible answers will change the outcome. Nadia reached into her work bag. She'd been in rooms like this before, different rooms across 20 years, different cities, different configurations of the basic scene, but the same essential architecture, the same moment of being weighed by a set of assumptions that had nothing to do with what she knew and everything to do with how she appeared and what she was wearing and what category the person at the counter had placed her in before she opened her mouth. She had learned over those 20 years that the response to this moment was not argument. Argument was loud and temporary. The record was not. She placed her business card on the counter. She did not say anything. Cole looked down at it. The card was heavy cream-coloured stock, clean and spare, the Meridian Drive Technologies logo in deep blue in the upper left corner, her name in centered type below it, and beneath her name, in slightly smaller type, the title Chief Engineer, Powertrain and Braking Systems. Cole read it. He read it again. The colour in his face changed the way colour changes in water when something moves beneath the surface. A shift that begins below and works upward. Not a flush, but something structural, the visual evidence of a belief being reorganized under pressure. The man in the orange chair had set his phone completely face down on the arm of the chair. He was watching without any pretense of doing otherwise. The woman near the coffee station had gone fully still and had moved, without appearing to decide to do so, 2 steps in the direction of the counter. Derek was reading the card from an angle, his head tilted at 4 degrees, reading something he wanted to make sure he was reading correctly. Cole picked up the card. He held it for a moment. He set it back down. He turned to the computer behind the counter and began moving through screens without speaking, and the lobby had gone to a silence that was pressurized rather than peaceful, held in the space between what had just happened and what had not yet been named. "I also have the applicable service manual page," Nadia said, "if you'd like to reconcile the labor entry yourself." She reached into her bag and placed a folded sheet of paper beside the business card, the factory service documentation for her vehicle's generation, the labor timetable. The relevant line was not highlighted. She had not needed to guess which line would matter. Cole did not pick up the paper. He looked at the screen. He looked at the original invoice. He looked at the card. He looked at Nadia, at a point slightly left of her shoulder and then back at the screen. "Let me pull the technician's time log," he said. "I'll wait," she said. Cole went to the back. The lobby held its silence. The woman who had been near the coffee station had quietly moved to one of the orange chairs and sat down. She did not take out her phone. The man already in the chair had not moved. Derek rearranged items on his side of the counter with careful attention. Cole was gone for 11 minutes. When he came back, he had a printout. He placed it face down on the counter for a moment, his palm flat on it before he turned it over. The technician's clock-in and clock-out time for Nadia's vehicle. The actual log time was 64 minutes, not 2 hours. Cole looked at the printout. He looked at the original invoice. He did not explain the discrepancy. He did not attempt to. He looked at a point slightly to the left of Nadia's shoulder, which was the same point he had looked at before, as if the explanation for the gap between 64 minutes and 2 hours might be found in the neutral air beside her. "We can adjust this," he said. "I know," she said. He wrote the corrected invoice by hand, drawing a single clean line through the original total and working through the revised figures beside it in small, careful numbers. Labour at 64 minutes at the applicable rate, parts at the posted markup. He initialed the change in 2 places. He did not ask Derek to do it. The revised total was $241. He slid it across the counter. Nadia looked at the corrected number. She paid it. She took her receipt and her keys. The business card remained on the counter. She left it. She was almost at the door when Cole spoke. "I didn't know," he said. Not quite an apology. Not quite an explanation. The sound of a man who had held a belief about a person and found the belief to be wrong and had not yet found the appropriate container for that information. Nadia stopped with her hand on the push bar of the glass door. The cold from outside pressed against the glass. The parking lot beyond it was grey under a November sky that had been overcast since morning. "That's the standard answer," she said, without heat, without bitterness, without any edge that would have been understandable, and that she had, over many years, learned to put down. But the number was either honest or it wasn't. That part didn't require knowing anything about me. She pushed through the door. The cold hit her forearms first, then her face, and she walked across the parking lot to her car without hurrying. The same walk she had across any parking lot on any Saturday, purposeful and unhurried, the walk of a woman who knows where she is going and does not perform the going. She unlocked the car and sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, not because she needed to collect herself, she was already collected, but because she was working through the sequence in her mind, what needed to be written down, in what order, with what supporting documentation. The photograph of the time log was on her phone. The corrected invoice was in her bag. The original invoice was in her bag. She had the service manual page. She had the business name and the date and the names from the badges. She had everything. She started the car. She drove home the way she always drove, a little under the speed limit on surface streets, hands at 9 and 3 watching the intersections. Inside the lobby, the silence held for a moment that was longer than a moment. Then, the man in the orange chair let out a slow breath through his nose. The woman who had moved to sit down looked at the door through which Nadia had left, and then looked at her lap. The middle-aged couple near the magazine rack had not reopened their magazines. Derek was looking at the business card still sitting on the counter. Cole stood with both hands resting on the edge of the register, the corrected invoice in front of him and the technician's time log beside it, and the business card between them both. He stood there in the lobby's particular quiet, and he was still standing there when the next customer came in, and the electronic chimes sounded above the door. What Nadia did in the days that followed was not loud, and it was not fast. It was deliberate in the way all of her work was deliberate. She did not post anything that afternoon. She went home and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and wrote up a complete factual account of the interaction. The date, the business name, the address, the name of the service manager, the original invoiced amount, the corrected amount, and the specific nature of the discrepancy. Labour time billed as 2 hours against the technician's own log time of 64 minutes and parts markup at 62% over the wholesale reference price. She noted that Cole had produced the technician's time log when asked, that the log confirmed the discrepancy, and that the invoice had been corrected when confronted with the documentation. She attached this to a folder she had kept since her second year as a principal engineer, following a similar experience at a shop in Columbus where a standard brake pad replacement had been billed at 90 minutes against a 22-minute flat rate standard. That first entry had been brief. Over 9 years and 4 cities through 17 separate incidents, the folder had grown into a document with a structure organised by date and location and the specific numeric gap between what was charged and what the reference materials supported. This became the 18th entry. The cover letter to the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles Auto Repair Unit took her 40 minutes to write on Monday evening, after she finished her last call from the office. She had written letters to regulatory bodies before, in different professional contexts, and she had learned the specific register that produced action rather than acknowledgement. No interpretation of intent, no characterization of the people involved, no adjectives that could be disputed, only the number that was charged, the number that was correct, the source for the correct number, and the documentation showing the gap. She attached both versions of the invoice. She attached a photograph of the technician's time log, which she had taken quietly while Cole was writing the corrected invoice. Her phone steady and the frame clean. She attached the factory service manual page with the labour time table. She noted the names from the badges and the approximate time of the interaction, and the exact sequence of events as she had experienced them. What was said first, what document was produced, at what point in the exchange each piece of information entered the conversation, and what the response was to each. She wrote it in the order that a regulatory investigator would need to reconstruct it, because she had learned from previous correspondence with regulatory bodies that a letter organized for the reader's process was the letter most likely to produce action. She sent the packet on Tuesday morning from her office before her 8:30 team call. She noted the date and the recipient in her folder. She did not follow up for 3 weeks, which was the standard window for an acknowledgement of receipt. When the acknowledgement arrived, it was a form letter, 2 paragraphs, informational only. She noted its receipt and went back to work. The Bureau opened a routine inquiry at Hargrove Automotive within 3 weeks. What the auditors found was not what anyone had staged or predicted. They were methodical people doing a methodical job, working through transaction records with no particular investment in any outcome other than accuracy. And what emerged from the records was that the pattern Nadia had documented in a single transaction was not isolated. Among customers in a specific demographic profile, labour times on common services ran at an average of 61 minutes longer than the same jobs billed to other customers in the same quarter. The parts markup differential was consistent across the same demographic grouping. It was not random. 87 affected transactions, $13,940 in aggregate overcharges over 18 months. The Bureau issued its finding: deceptive trade practices under the Ohio Consumer Sales Practices Act. Kohl's operating license carried 2 formal violations. Derek's, 1. The remediation order required full restitution to all identified customers within 90 days and mandated a customer notification process that the Bureau oversaw directly. 112 people received checks in the mail over the 90-day window. Most of them didn't know why. The form letter explained that an audit of a service facility had identified billing irregularities and that the enclosed check represented the difference between what they had been charged and the correct amount as determined by the Bureau's audit. The amounts varied. Some were small, $30 or $40. Some were larger. The largest single restitution in the identified period was $208. Most people cashed the checks without further inquiry. Some called the number on the letter. A few wrote back to the Bureau to express some version of gratitude or relief or the particular emotion that comes from having a wrong acknowledged and corrected by the official machinery that was supposed to prevent it in the first place. The Bureau passed those letters on without forwarding any information about the source of the complaint. Nadia's name appeared nowhere in what those 112 people received. She had not wanted it to. The outcome was the outcome. The check arriving in the envelope was the thing that mattered, not who had generated the process that produced it. At Meridian Drive Technologies, the braking architecture program moved forward. Nadia had restructured the project timeline in her first 6 weeks, identifying 3 points where the prior team had been adding complexity that the specification didn't require, and removing it had freed engineering hours for the work that was genuinely difficult. By spring, she had added 2 senior engineers to the team, people she had recruited personally, choosing them for the same quality she had always chosen people for in technical work: honesty about what they didn't know, precision about what they did. Her office on the 3rd floor had a window that faced east and a wall behind her desk where she had hung the framed copy of the yellow legal pad. The original lived in a box in her apartment, the paper gone soft at the folds from years of being opened and refolded. The copy she had made on a fresh sheet, her father's column headers in her own handwriting, and at the bottom, his phrase in her printing, and beneath that, in smaller letters, one line she had added herself: "The work tells the truth. The invoice better match." And below it, "Both invoices." She had her coffee at her desk on Thursday mornings before the calls began, when the floor was still and the east light came in clean and flat without shadow. She would hold the mug in both hands and look at the yellow paper for a moment, only a moment, and then she would turn to the screen and start working. The program she was running was the kind of work her father would have recognized. Not in its specific form, not in the $40 million or the electric motors or the computational modeling, but in the principle underneath all of it: that the work must be done correctly, that the correct method is knowable, and that the distance between the honest answer and the dishonest one is a distance that can always be measured. He had taught her how to measure it. She was still measuring it every day in every room she walked into. He had taught her how to measure it. She had been doing so ever since. Here is what I want you to take with you before we're done. There is a version of this story where Nadia Osi pays $412 and walks out of the lobby and does not go back. That version exists, and it is not a small version. The calculation of whether a fight is worth the cost is real, and most people make it, and most of the time the math says, let it go, because the drain of continuing will cost more than the difference. That math is not wrong. But Nadia did not make that calculation. Not because she had a title on a business card. The card was a document of what she knew, not the reason she acted, and she had known what she knew long before any institution had given it a title. She acted because her father had taught her that a number is either honest or it isn't, and that the appropriate response to a dishonest number is not rage and not a scene at the counter. It is the patient, accurate, documented presentation of what the number should be and the mechanism by which that presentation enters the record. You do not need a title to do that. You need to know the correct number. You need the language to write it down clearly. You need to understand that documentation is not a consolation for people who lost the argument in the room. It is the argument. The room is temporary. The record persists. 112 people received what was owed to them because one woman sat at her kitchen table on a Saturday evening with a cover letter and a folder she had been keeping for 9 years. The system worked because someone used it, correctly and completely, and did not stop when it would have been easier to stop. If there is someone in your life who handed you the honest number when the dishonest one was more convenient, hold that name tonight, in a kitchen, at a workbench, on a yellow legal pad. Wherever they were when they taught you that the invoice better matched the work. The work tells the truth. Pass it on.